Hello and welcome to my channel once again. I thought I would come back and talk to you about something that is kind of should precede the whole process of writing a story, but it's often just assumed that the answer is already known to this question. The question is, how do you know if your idea is a good one? How do you know if it's worth spending hours and hours, possibly even days, writing a short story at all? You know. So I had a little think about this, and I've come up with some pointers. Well, all I can offer is the usual disclaimer that this is to do with my method, and it may not suit everyone, but I think these are fairly universal observations I'm going to make, hopefully. If I was going to be very flippant and simplistic, I would say that the only real way to know if a story is worth writing is to try and write it. Sometimes you're literally not going to have a clue. If it's a very unusual idea, something that hasn't been done before, something that you haven't done before, then perhaps the only way to find out if it is a good thing is to do it. This is easier said than done when your idea is going to turn out to be a 5,000 words short story rather than a 1,000 word or flash piece or something. But there are certain ideas that you're just going to have to try out to find out. But I have another system, another strategy which I use frequently, whereas especially with these 5 random words inspired stories that I write on this channel. And that the idea is basically to leave it to percolate. So I'll look at the words, try and memorize them, and then I'll go for a run, usually. Or sometimes I'll just go for a walk. You could theoretically also just do a lot of housework, something mundane, something that fills up your hands and your body and some routine part of your brain, but leaves the other part to sort of roam randomly. You'll find that things kind of just slot into place and just sort of either make sense or don't. The other idea with that is if you leave it long enough, it'll either keep coming back and nagging you to write it, or it'll just dissolve and run away, and it will not come back. And that can be a good thing, because perhaps some of your ideas aren't very good. Some of my ideas certainly aren't very good. So yeah, quite often I'll let it stew for a bit. More often than not these days I'll give it a try, but there are times, particularly with a longer piece, when you want to just let it percolate, to let the ideas flow into slot into place. The other thing that will help you figure out whether it's time to write the story is, do you have 3 things? The start, and by that I mean where we're coming into the story, what moment are we seeing at the beginning of this thing? The ending, have you got a way to pull out? The equivalent of the camera panning up and through the trees, as happens in umpteen movies, to tell you it's over. Do you have a moment to leave the story? And do you have a crisis point? Because I believe there does have to be some moment somewhere in that story where a character has either a physical action they undertake that's dramatic, that makes a change in their life, or a realization that makes an internal change in the way that they see the world. So one of those 2 things probably has to happen. Otherwise, you're just watching somebody wander around their room, effectively having a normal day, and that's not really going to work. It's not going to have the narrative power, I don't think. It might be a wonderful piece of descriptive writing, but it won't be a story as such. So if you've got those 3 things, you're halfway there. The other thing, obviously, worth asking is, do you have characters worth spending time with? Do you have at least one person who's interesting enough that we want to follow their actions, we want to follow their thoughts? It may take a while to develop that character. Sometimes you can start writing something and then the character comes in subsequent redrafts. That often goes against what the sort of common sense view is, where you come up with a character first and then the story that occurs to them. But that's not always the way that ideation happens. Sometimes an idea for a plot line will occur, and then you have to decide who's the best person to slot into that plot line, and it's usually the person to whom the events will be most dramatic or most transformational. So let's imagine you've got the idea, it's percolated, it won't go away. You've got a beginning, an ending, and a crisis point. and you have at least one character who's worth spending some time with. Another question to ask is it unique? Is there something unusual in what you're saying? Now, obviously, you're not going to entirely know that. You haven't read all of world literature, I assume. So it may well be that, I don't know, Dostoevsky wrote a short story that's very similar in structure and theme. But that's not to say that you can't write your version of it, because you'll have a unique take. So you can have a unique viewpoint on a story that's been told 1,000 times. But it should be unique. And it should be interesting enough that you want to come back to it, and that it feels it needs to be told. And then a sort of related point is, can you visualize it? Do you have strong images coming into your head when you think about the story? If you imagine playing it like it's a film that you're watching. Just sort of run through the opening scene of that story. How much of that can you see clearly? Because if you can't really see it, if it's very fuzzy, you perhaps have to think about it a little more, perhaps go a little bit further into character or plot just to build it a little bit more, what's the word? Just to get a bit more granular and detailed before you attempt to write the thing. And the other question comes, the other related point is about research. Do you know enough to write that story? Because it may be that you, if I was writing something about, somebody who's creating an artist who wants to create an NFT. You may have heard about these NFTs, which are sort of digital artworks that are stamped and located on the blockchain, so that theoretically the artist has a original that can be identified as your artist's original and then sold to somebody as a unique artwork. Anyway, it's a slightly esoteric concept, but it's a very big deal at the moment, and to write about that kind of thing, you have to do some research, because you have to be able to explain the principles behind the story hopefully not in an info dump sort of way, but there may be things that you have to have characters say to one another to explain what's going on. So do you know enough to write it? And obviously that also pertains to writing about characters that aren't you, somebody of a different gender, race, background, someone from history, someone from the far future. Obviously you can't really research someone from the far future, but you can certainly do some research into other cultures, other times, ways of speaking, so forth, just to make sure you don't, write anything horribly problematic or embarrassing. You want it to feel authentic. You want it to be true. And finally, one that I have to admit I don't pay so much attention to, maybe not as much as I should, who knows. Is there an audience for this story? Is there anyone who would want to read this? For me, that's only really important if I'm writing for, say, a competition or a specific market. If I'm writing for, I don't know, one of these magazines here, I just pick one at random. If I was writing for this Progenitor magazine, I might look at their work and decide that what they like is very well observed stories set in the here and now, often internal worlds, internal monologues. That's the kind of thing that they like, and that's the kind of thing I sent them. So I have to admit, I did a little bit of research. Probably when I was submitting that, I usually look at the website of the literary magazine, look at the beginnings of a few of their stories, maybe read a few. But to be honest, I don't put a huge amount of work in, because I have to make a large number of submissions in order to get the requisite number of acceptances. I'll do another video about that at some point. And finally, it comes back to that's where we started, which is you may have all these things. You may have an idea that refuses to die, a beginning, an end, and a point of crisis, characters that are fascinating, a uniqueness to your story, very clearly visualizable aspects. You might see the opening scene. You know enough about any of the subjects that you're covering in it, any of the jobs that the characters do or their aspects of their lives and background, and you believe that there will be a readership for it. Still, you're only going to know if you try. You have to write it. So that's the end of my little discussion of what you need in order to know that your story is worth writing. So basically, yeah, go and write it. and then come back and tell me whether any of this was helpful. And I'll see you again with a short story very soon. Bye-bye.